In 1944, a soldier crouched in a foxhole somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy, unwrapped a small brown block from foil, and took a bite. He did not smile. He did not savor it. Army records describe the taste as barely better than a boiled potato, and soldiers who ate it were not shy about saying so, calling it, half-jokingly, Hitler's secret weapon. By the end of World War II, the Hershey Company had produced more than 3 billion of these bars. 3 billion. Not for birthdays, not for candy dishes, for survival. Packed into pockets and life rafts and parachute kits, engineered so that a starving man could keep walking. This was not dessert. This was fuel, deliberately made unpleasant so that no one would eat it except in an emergency. A piece of chocolate you were not supposed to enjoy. And yet, 200 years before that, chocolate had been the single most exclusive luxury in the royal courts of Europe, whipped by servants in gold cups for queens who drank nothing else before noon. So how did a drink once reserved for emperors and monarchs end up rationed to soldiers in a foxhole, judged not by flavor, but by how many calories it could cram into 4 ounces? How did it go from a sacred currency traded for gold to a bar deliberately engineered to taste bad? That transformation is the story of empire, slavery, chemistry, and war, and it does not start in a European court at all. It starts in a jungle, in Mesoamerica, roughly 4,000 years ago. Long before anyone in Europe had ever heard the word cacao, the tree that produces it, Theobroma cacao, grew wild in the tropical understory of what is now southern Mexico and Central America. The pods themselves are strange objects, ridged and football-shaped, sprouting directly from the trunk of the tree rather than from its branches, and inside them sits a white, faintly sweet pulp wrapped around 30 to 40 bitter purple-brown seeds. Nothing about a raw cacao pod suggests chocolate. The seeds are intensely bitter, almost inedible on their own, and turning them into anything resembling the chocolate people eat today required a process nobody could have stumbled into by accident. Harvesting the pods, fermenting the seeds for days to develop flavor, drying them, roasting them, grinding them into a paste. Archaeological residue found on pottery in Honduras dating back roughly to 1800 BCE suggests that the earliest use of cacao was not even for the seeds. It was for the sweet pulp, likely fermented into a mildly alcoholic beverage, centuries before anyone thought to do anything with the bitter beans inside. The people who first cultivated cacao did not have the word genetics. They were doing it anyway, selecting trees, refining fermentation times, passing techniques down through generations of trial and error until they had turned an almost inedible seed into the basis of a civilization's economy and religion. By around 1500 BCE, the Olmec, one of the earliest complex civilizations in Mesoamerica, were cultivating cacao in what is now the Gulf Coast of Mexico. The word cacao itself likely descends from an Olmec or Mesozoic root, which later peoples across the region borrowed and adapted. When the Maya civilization rose to dominance across the Yucatan Peninsula centuries later, they inherited cacao and elevated it into something close to sacred. Maya mythology held that cacao was a gift from the gods, discovered in a mountain that also contained maize, the other pillar of Mesoamerican civilization. Now, that story is almost certainly a myth in the literal sense, but the fact that cacao was woven into creation mythology at all tells you exactly how central it had become. The Maya drank cacao, mixed with water, chili peppers, cornmeal, and spices, frothed by pouring it back and forth between vessels from a height, producing a thick, bitter, foamy drink that bore almost no resemblance to a modern hot chocolate. It was consumed at weddings, at funerals, in religious ceremonies, and among the elite, who were sometimes buried with vessels of it for the afterlife. Cacao was not just a beverage. It was medicine, ritual, and status, all in one bitter cup. The Aztec Empire, which rose to dominance in central Mexico centuries after the Maya, took cacao's role even further. Because the Aztec heartland around Tenochtitlan was too high in elevation and too dry to grow cacao trees, the empire had to import every single bean through tribute and trade from lowland regions it conquered or dominated. This scarcity turned cacao beans into something remarkable: money. Actual, literal currency. Spanish chroniclers who arrived in the early 1500s documented Aztec markets where cacao beans were used to buy goods ranging from tomatoes to turkeys to the services of a laborer for a day. A rabbit might cost roughly 30 beans. A turkey might run closer to 100. Historical accounts even describe counterfeiters carefully hollowing out cacao beans and refilling them with dirt or wax to pass as real currency, which tells you that as early as the 1500s, people were already committing fraud with chocolate. Emperor Moctezuma II reportedly kept vast storehouses of cacao beans, and Spanish accounts claim he drank the beverage dozens of times a day, sometimes flavored with vanilla and served in golden goblets that were used once and then discarded. Whether every detail of that account is accurate remains debated among historians relying on second-hand Spanish sources, but the broader picture is not in dispute. In the Aztec world, cacao funded empires, paid soldiers, and sat at the literal center of economic life. Money, in the most direct sense imaginable, grew on trees. This is where the story takes a turn nobody in Mesoamerica could have predicted. In 1519, the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of what is now Mexico, and within 2 years, his forces, aided by disease and rival indigenous alliances, had toppled the Aztec Empire. Cortés and his men encountered cacao early, and their first reaction was not enthusiasm. It was confusion, and in some cases, open disgust. Spanish accounts describe the Aztec drink as bitter, strange, and closer to a medicine than a treat, something the Spanish were not eager to adopt. It took decades of adaptation, adding sugar, cinnamon, and vanilla before cacao began to appeal to European palates at all. Here is the detail that makes this strange. The very substance that would eventually become one of the most beloved treats on the planet was, at first contact, something European conquerors could barely stomach. It was not until Spanish colonists and missionaries in the New World began sweetening the drink that it started its slow journey toward the version people recognize today. Once chocolate reached Spain sometime in the mid to late 1500s, the Spanish crown and clergy treated it as a state secret for nearly a century, guarding the knowledge of its preparation and limiting its spread across Europe. But secrets involving royal marriages rarely stay secret for long. In 1615, the Spanish Princess Anne of Austria married King Louis XIII of France, and she reportedly brought her love of chocolate with her to the French court. From there, chocolate began its slow migration through the aristocracies of Europe, moving from Spain to France to Italy to England over the course of the 1600s, remaining at every stop a luxury reserved almost exclusively for royalty and nobility who could afford the imported beans and the sugar needed to make it palatable. Chocolate houses began opening in cities like London by the 1650s, essentially the private members' clubs of their era, where wealthy patrons gathered to drink chocolate, discuss politics, and be seen. This was not candy. It was a status symbol, closer in social function to a fine imported wine than to anything a person today would recognize as chocolate. And here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. European clergy spent decades arguing in complete seriousness about whether drinking chocolate broke a religious fast. Because chocolate was consumed as a liquid rather than eaten as a solid, some theologians argued it did not violate fasting rules the way solid food would, essentially treating a thick, calorie-dense spiced beverage as though it were closer to water than to a meal. Other clergymen disagreed vehemently, and the debate stretched across multiple councils and papal rulings over more than a century. And no, that is not something anyone made up for a punchline. That was a real theological argument conducted by real bishops in real correspondence with real popes over a beverage that had been sacred to the Maya for entirely different reasons 1,000 years earlier. But behind every royal cup of chocolate sipped in Madrid or Paris or London sat a brutal and expanding system of forced labor. And this is where the story stops being charming. As European demand for cacao grew across the 16 and 1700s, and as sugar, chocolate's essential partner, became a plantation commodity in its own right, colonial powers needed enormous quantities of labor to grow, harvest, and process both crops in the tropical regions where they thrived. Spanish colonizers had already devastated indigenous populations in Mesoamerica through disease and forced labor in the decades following the conquest. And as cacao cultivation expanded into new colonial territories in South America and later into West Africa, plantation owners turned overwhelmingly to enslaved labor to meet the demand. On islands like São Tomé and Príncipe off the coast of West Africa, which by the late 1800s had become major cacao producers under Portuguese colonial control, investigations in the early 1900s by journalists and cocoa buyers, including a famous report commissioned by the British chocolate manufacturer Cadbury, documented labor conditions on the plantations that were functionally indistinguishable from slavery decades after slavery had been formally abolished under Portuguese law. Workers were transported from Angola under contracts they had not freely entered, subjected to brutal conditions, and denied the ability to return home. Cacao did not just benefit from forced labor. In region after region, across 3 centuries, cacao cultivation drove the demand for it. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because the darkest chapter of chocolate's history is not entirely in the past. Today, roughly 70% of the world's cocoa comes from West Africa, with Côte d'Ivoire alone producing more cocoa than any other country on Earth, over 2 million metric tons a year. And within that supply chain, investigations by journalists, the United States Department of Labor, and non-governmental organizations have repeatedly documented the use of child labor on cocoa farms in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, including cases of children working with machetes, applying pesticides without protective equipment, and in some of the most severe documented cases, being trafficked and forced to work without pay. Major chocolate companies have pledged for more than 2 decades to eliminate child labor from their supply chains, and progress has been made. But as of the most recent large-scale surveys, well over 1 million children in the cocoa-growing regions of West Africa were still found to be engaged in some form of labor connected to cocoa production. Here is the uncomfortable reality that the industry has spent decades trying to fully resolve. The same crop that once funded Aztec emperors and delighted European royalty still, in the 21st century, moves through a supply chain shadowed by exploitation. This is the part that should make you angry. And it is also the part that explains why fair trade and direct trade labeling on chocolate packaging exists at all. While cacao's darkest chapter was unfolding on plantations, a separate and almost accidental revolution was transforming chocolate itself from a drink into a solid. And this is where the story shifts from exploitation to invention. For roughly 300 years after the Spanish first brought cacao to Europe, chocolate existed almost exclusively as a beverage, thick, greasy from the natural cocoa butter in the beans, and difficult to digest in large quantities. That changed in 1828, when a Dutch chemist named Coenraad Johannes van Houten patented a hydraulic press capable of squeezing much of the fat, the cocoa butter, out of roasted ground cacao beans, leaving behind a dry cake that could be pulverized into a fine powder. Van Houten also developed a process, later called Dutch processing, that treated the powder with alkaline salts to reduce its bitterness and darken its color. This single invention did 2 enormous things at once. It made cocoa powder cheap and easy to mix into water or milk, and it produced a surplus of pure cocoa butter, a smooth, stable fat that had no obvious use in the beverage trade at all. That surplus sat around for almost 2 decades, until a British chocolate maker named Joseph Fry figured out what to do with it. In 1847, Fry's company in Bristol discovered that by combining cocoa powder, sugar, and melted cocoa butter rather than water, they could produce a paste that could be poured into a mold and would set into a solid bar once it cooled. This was, as far as the historical record shows, the first true eating chocolate bar in the modern sense, a moment that took a beverage 4,000 years old and turned it almost overnight into a solid confection. From there, the pace of innovation accelerated. In 1875, a Swiss chocolatier named Daniel Peter, working with his neighbor Henri Nestlé, who had recently developed a powdered milk process, combined the two ideas to create the first milk chocolate bar, smoother and less bitter than anything made with pure cocoa solids alone. 4 years later, in 1879, another Swiss chocolate maker, Rodolphe Lindt, accidentally left a chocolate mixing machine running overnight in his factory. What should have been a mistake turned into the invention of conching, a process of continuously grinding and aerating chocolate for hours, which smoothed out the gritty texture that had defined chocolate for centuries and produced the silky, melt-in-your-mouth quality people now consider essential to good chocolate. A machine left running by accident is the reason modern chocolate does not feel like chewing on sand. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, an American named Milton Hershey was building an entirely different kind of chocolate empire. One built not on delicate craftsmanship, but on scale. After visiting the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and seeing German chocolate-making machinery on display, Hershey purchased the equipment and pivoted his existing caramel business toward mass-produced milk chocolate. He built an entire company town in rural Pennsylvania around his factory, and by the early 1900s, Hershey had cracked something none of the elegant European chocolatiers had prioritized: making chocolate cheap enough and produced at high enough volume for ordinary working-class Americans to buy a bar for a nickel. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. It set the stage for exactly the kind of dense, mass-manufacturable, endlessly scalable product that a government would need decades later when it went looking for a way to feed millions of soldiers scattered across every climate on Earth. The idea of using chocolate to fuel soldiers did not begin in World War II. It stretches back at least to the Napoleonic Wars and the American Civil War, when chocolate was already recognized in a rough, informal way as a compact, high-energy food that traveled well and did not spoil quickly compared to fresh rations. During World War I, chocolate bars were included in some soldiers' rations and care packages from home, valued for morale as much as nutrition. But it was World War II that turned chocolate from a battlefield comfort into a precisely engineered military specification. In 1937, the United States Army Quartermaster Corps, anticipating the possibility of another major war, approached the Hershey Company with a request that sounds almost absurd on paper: design a chocolate bar that soldiers would not want to eat. The Army's reasoning was blunt. This was meant to be an emergency ration, something a soldier would carry for days or weeks without touching, to be consumed only if he became separated from his unit or ran out of food entirely. If the bar tasted good, soldiers would eat it out of boredom or hunger long before an actual emergency, defeating its entire purpose. Captain, later Colonel, Paul Logan worked directly with Hershey's chemists to establish 4 requirements. The bar had to weigh 4 ounces. It had to be extremely high in food energy. It had to withstand high temperatures without melting, and it had to taste, in the Army's own official language, only a little better than a boiled potato. Think about that for a second. A government agency formally specified in writing that a food product should taste barely better than a boiled potato, and an entire chocolate company engineered a recipe specifically to hit that target. Hershey's chemists achieved it by reducing the sugar content and increasing the proportion of chocolate liquor, the thick, intensely bitter paste made from pure ground cacao beans, producing a bar so dense and dry that it could not even be poured into molds using standard chocolate-making equipment. Workers had to press it by hand. The result, officially named Field Ration D and universally called the D-Ration by the troops who carried it, delivered roughly 600 calories per 4-ounce bar. 600 calories. 3 bars, the standard daily allotment, provided about 1,800 calories, which military nutritionists at the time considered the bare minimum a soldier needed to keep functioning in an emergency. This was not about seasoning food. This was about survival math. calories per ounce, calories per soldier, calories per day, engineered with the same cold precision as ammunition. Soldiers, predictably, hated it, and the historical record on this is full of complaints. It was so hard, some men described trying to shave slivers off with a knife rather than bite it. It was so dense it reportedly caused constipation thanks to its concentrated cocoa content, which is part of how it earned its darkly humorous nickname among the troops, Hitler's secret weapon. The guidance issued alongside the bar instructed soldiers to nibble it slowly over roughly 30 minutes, or to dissolve pieces in hot water to make a drinkable substitute for cocoa, rather than eating it the way a person eats a candy bar. And yet it worked exactly as designed. It survived tropical heat, Arctic cold, and rough transport far better than most alternative field foods available at the time. When American troops landed on the beaches at Normandy on June 6, 1944, roughly 150,000 Allied soldiers carried some version of Hershey's ration chocolate among their gear. As the war dragged into the Pacific theater, the original bar's heat tolerance proved insufficient for jungle conditions, and in 1943, Hershey engineers developed an improved version, the tropical chocolate bar, capable of withstanding even higher temperatures while tasting slightly less punishing than its predecessor. By the time the war ended in 1945, Hershey had manufactured more than 3 billion ration bars, and at peak production, the company's Pennsylvania factory was turning out over 20 million bars a week. The wartime demand for military chocolate was so overwhelming that it likely saved Hershey's civilian business entirely, at a moment when the United States government was seriously considering shutting down candy production nationwide to conserve ration sugar and milk for the war effort. Chocolate did not just fuel soldiers. It fueled the survival of the company that made it. This military relationship with chocolate did not end when the war did. Field rations developed for the Korean War and the Vietnam War continued to include chocolate components, refined over the decades to resist melting in increasingly extreme environments, from Arctic cold weather units to desert deployments. Modern meal, ready-to-eat rations, the standard American field ration used today, routinely includes some form of chocolate or cocoa-based product, whether a candy component or a high-calorie energy bar built on the same core logic Colonel Logan and Hershey's chemists established back in 1937. Dense, stable, calorie-rich, and engineered for function first. Militaries in other countries have followed similar logic, and chocolate-based energy products remain a staple of expedition food for polar explorers, mountaineers, and even components of astronaut food supplies developed by space agencies. Because the same properties that make chocolate valuable to a soldier crossing a desert, high caloric density, chemical stability, and resistance to spoilage, make it valuable to anyone operating far from resupply. But chocolate is far more than just food, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Chocolate contains a compound called theobromine, a natural stimulant closely related to caffeine, which is precisely why chocolate is dangerous, sometimes fatally so, for dogs and cats, whose bodies cannot metabolize theobromine efficiently, something worth remembering the next time a pet gets into an open box of chocolates. On the human side, ongoing nutritional research has examined flavonols found in cocoa for potential effects on blood flow and cardiovascular markers. Though scientists caution that the highly processed chocolate sold on store shelves today, loaded with sugar and stripped of many of the beneficial compounds during processing, bears little resemblance to the cocoa used in these studies. And here is a genuinely startling modern fact. The global chocolate and cocoa market, built from a bean that Spanish conquistadors initially found repulsive, is now valued at well over $100 billion a year, with projections from multiple market research firms placing it above $200 billion within the next decade. Switzerland, the country most associated with luxury chocolate today, consumes roughly 8 to 9 kilograms of chocolate per person every single year, more than any other nation on Earth. A quiet irony given that cacao has never grown naturally anywhere near the Swiss Alps. It was there, in the jungles of Mesoamerica 4,000 years ago, when the first people fermented a bitter seed into something worth drinking. It was there in Aztec marketplaces, functioning as literal money. It was there when Spanish conquistadors first recoiled from its bitterness, and there decades later when European royalty could not get enough of it. It was there in theological arguments about religious fasting, in gilded chocolate houses in London, and in the brutal forced labor plantations of São Tomé that supplied it for centuries. It was there when a Dutch chemist's hydraulic press and a Swiss machine left running by mistake overnight turned a beverage into a bar. It was there on the beaches of Normandy, in the pockets of 150,000 soldiers, deliberately engineered to taste only a little better than a boiled potato, so that no one would eat it until they truly needed to. And it is there, right now, sitting in your kitchen cabinet or your desk drawer, costing less than the price of a cup of coffee. Utterly unremarkable. Utterly ordinary. Not bad for a bitter jungle seed that European conquerors originally could not stand to drink. If any part of this surprised you, let me know in the comments which one, because there is always another piece to these stories that most people never hear. Hit subscribe if you want more of this kind of history, and I will see you in the next one.